Mr. Bill Kelly, thank you very much for joining. William Kelly, what is your current occupation?
Thank you, Tieho. I appreciate you having me on. So my current occupation I view as an educator and a protector of the end investor. I think it's a very important role. I think we're at a very interesting inflection point of the capital markets, and in terms of thinking about where we are, an opportunity in a very complex world, I very much put the investor interest front and center. So first and foremost, investor advocate is how I would sum up my role.
Interesting. Now, how does your expertise contribute to the economies of cities?
Well, maybe I'll zoom further out and then come back in again. So the current vessel under which I practice this investor first mantra is the CAIA Association. We're a non-for-profit, but with a massive global reach, a professional body that's focused on bringing greater awareness to more and diverse risk premia, maybe in the common vernacular referred to alternative investments. And alternatives came into the landscape as an allocator, probably going back decades ago when the sovereign wealth funds were very early in some of the endowments and foundations. But around the late 1990s, a lot of institutional investors started bringing alternatives into the portfolio, and there's no professional body, a la what the CFA was back then to traditional. There's no body focused on alternative investment. So that's how we began, and that's my current role as CEO of the CAIA Association. I proudly serve almost 12,000 members in 100 different countries, and we've got 6,000 people sitting for the exam annually. So getting to your specific question, an important aspect of alternative investments is infrastructure, and it doesn't always grab the headlines. Private equity and the private markets has been really what's been in vogue over the last several years, and maybe even going back to the GFC. But the infrastructure needs globally, and especially in emerging markets, are enormous. And to think that the sovereigns can do it themselves is pure fallacy. We've got a run-up in the debt in most sovereigns' balance sheets, and I think institutional investors should be really thinking about this as both an asset class to earn a better bottom line, but also thinking about it, the better double bottom line by earning a good return and doing well at the same time. And the infrastructure reinvestment around the world, as I said, is enormous. We've got an emerging middle class in many parts of the world, and we've got to make sure that the infrastructure around universities, hospitals, toll roads, airports is all in place, and there's a tremendous opportunity and responsibility there as well.
Very, very interesting. And if I may add myself, I mean, the CAIA designation is a very, very powerful qualification. So, I mean, I can speak from experience, having done your introductory program, which is the fundamentals of alternative investments. And that's something that I will definitely like to, sort of advocate for, to government officials or anyone that's just interested to understand what the alternative investments and the capital markets, are all about. And I would like to move on to the next question. In your opinion, what is the role of a city in society and the economy?
Well, I think that we're coming up to an inauguration in the U.S. Tomorrow, so this isn't so much a political statement, but there's an old saying in the U.S. that all politics are local, and what goes on in the precincts affects what goes on in the world. And I think the roles of cities and municipalities have a tremendous responsibility to shape a dialogue and a level of cooperation and discussion, and hopefully rise above the political fray. And I think that they have an opportunity and, again, a responsibility to really make the world economy a better place. They can't do it alone. And the old saying as well, it takes a village, and that clearly is the case. And we have to have greater cooperation and responsibility ultimately from the citizen on the ground. And we saw this in COVID. We see it time and time again with climate, that when the going gets tough, I think most of us turn to the sovereign, the city, the town, the federal infrastructure to say, hey, you need to go ahead and fix this. And certainly with COVID, there was that responsibility, and certainly the fiscal stimulus was very much warranted. But what about our responsibilities? And what are we doing today to make the world a better place? And I think every one of us individually has to ask that question. And I think a lot of these ideas and maybe a new culture can be born out of these precincts where we know our neighbor. And we know what makes them tick, and we don't have to love everything about them, but we have to respect their opinions. And I think there perhaps could be the beginnings of a greater level of responsibility of what it means to be not only citizens of a city, but citizens of a world.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm sure I wouldn't be misinformed if I would say that the world has never faced such a very challenging period as far as global society is concerned. I certainly haven't read of any pandemic of this scale in recorded history. And so, even though we talk about the role of cities in society, but I think the responsibility of the citizen is certainly very highlighted during this time. And thank you for highlighting that. So how can technology help local governments to attract alternative investment capital flows?
Well, we've got, and I think this is true of every industry. And the example I sometimes use, Tieho, is the poor cab dispatcher who was sitting there at his desk with his rotary phone, not realizing that something called Uber was being developed in the background. And by the time he figured it out and turned around, he was run over and crushed by the Uber driver. And the job that he once had, in this case, it was usually a he, no longer existed. And I think that should be emblematic of our thought process as professionals, regardless of industry. And it doesn't have to be the level of paranoia about looking over our shoulder, but I think it should be more about the paranoia of looking forward and understanding where your skill gaps are and proactively going out and trying to fill them before it's too late. When I think about ingenuity and innovation at the sovereign level, both maybe country and down to city and town, it is very much of a mixed bag. And in the good old days before COVID, and I hopefully will get back to this someday, I had the opportunity, the privilege, and the responsibility of traveling around the world and both listening and imparting wisdom that I learned along the way. And when I think about the countries that I've visited, one that stands out that has gotten this so right is Singapore. Their investment in their people, their investment in education, their investment in the future is one of the most important and valuable commodities to that country. And I think it really is an example that we should all follow. I was recently on a conference call, actually just last week, and learning about some of the things that Canada is doing specifically in Montreal with AI and further development and investment in cross-skilling and upskilling employees. And it's a tremendous, tremendous responsibility. We're looking at this as CAIA, as an organization. We recently brought out a new credential called Financial Data Professional, try to cross-skill and upskill the analysts. But one of our advisory board members, Jane Buchanan, who's one of the smartest investors I ever met, she's one of the founders of PAMCO way back when, which at one point was the largest fund of funds in the world. She's encouraged us to turn that funnel around and think about a broader ecosystem of the middle and back offices where most of the jobs are. They're going to be disrupted as well. So it is a very awesome undertaking in terms of size and scale and opportunity. But I think it's got to start with engagement, certainly from the sovereign side, cities, towns, countries. But we as professionals have to very much stick our nose into this as well and make it our responsibility.
Right. So, I think I'm just so excited about this particular interview because, for some reason you just keep on hitting on points that really interest me as well. When you mentioned Singapore, I've followed Lee Kuan Yew's work simply because, some of the big names in alternative investments have mentioned him quite a few times. And when I've analyzed some of the African countries that had, sort of small populations of around 2 million people, And they pretty much, most of them pretty much got independence at the very same time that Singapore got its independence. But if you look at the natural endowment or the geographical endowment of these African countries, most of them had far more than Singapore had, right? But Singapore committed to a human capital sort of paradigm of their economy, and they pretty much positioned themselves as a global economy and investing in the education of the people, and that really sort of provided them the agility that they needed as a small country to become a service economy, and they've done that quite well. So that is something that I always like to point out to a lot of African countries, that the people are everything. The natural resources will run out, and if anything, the digital economy and the service economy is just so huge that you cannot keep focusing on natural resources. And I think that's also something that the Middle East is also um, putting a loudspeaker on. They always talk about how they're so cognizant of the emerging economies, whether digital or clean energy, because they know that the oil will soon run out too. So very, very interesting point on Singapore. So what assurance and insurance do alternative investment managers need to invest in a city? So what type of, level of comfort in terms of assurance and insurance would someone like yourself or your peers be looking for, Bill?
Well, yeah, I think if I had to sum it up in 2 words, it would be due diligence, Tieho. And I think ultimately, as an investor, you got to do your homework, which is maybe a simpler way of saying due diligence. Uh, I think that investors can be very much homers in terms of much greater comfort in their home market, because in the good old days, you could walk out of your house and go and look at the investment, touch and feel it. And the further you get away from the home front, the more difficult it is and less comfort level. And then ultimately, you often hear the career risk of wandering too far afield, where if the upside's there, you're a hero. If it's not, you get sacked. So I think that those all factor in. But the world is becoming much more of a global community. We're connected in so many ways, both good and bad. And COVID showed the bad side of how connected we really are as a world. We're a global community. And thinking about opportunities around the world as your opportunity zone should be very much on the minds of every investors. And it makes sense from a large standpoint, too, that Howard Marks is a letter writer at Oaktree. His memos are not behind a paywall, and he just came out with one recently on value investing and where he views that versus growth. And I think that it would be an interesting aside for your readers and listeners to think about, Tieho. But as I think about global opportunities, and now actually I think I lost my way with the Howard Marks thing. Could you just repeat the question to me again? I get off on this tangent with Howard.
Of course, of course. Very rightfully so. He's a very, very interesting gentleman, and I've seen some of his interviews on Milken. So the question was, what assurance?
Now I remembered actually just saying that. Thank you. About opportunities globally. I'm sorry, it's tough getting hold. But as I think about some of these emerging markets and opportunities, I mentioned infrastructure before, private equity as an example as well, or private markets. We just did a signing ceremony with the Private Equity and Venture Capital Association of Saudi Arabia as an example. And when you think about Saudi, you think about oil dependency and an economy that may be up for a world of hurt in the coming future. But what the kingdom is doing there is awesome. They've created these local pods of learning and VC investment, and it's spurred by the sovereigns, and they're really going out of their way to attract capital, and it's wrapped in transparency, it's wrapped in education. And I think this can be true of many, many parts of the world. And I look at demographics too, Tieho, and certainly in parts of Europe and in many parts of the US and North American economies and maybe Japan as a poster child, where these demographics are moving older, not younger. But you get into some of these emerging markets like in Nigeria as an example, or parts of India, the demographics there are awesome, and the emerging middle class and the power of that is going to be tremendous. And when I think about investment opportunity, it's found in huge pockets of inefficiency. And you certainly have to do your homework and due diligence, as I mentioned a moment ago, but getting into the middle of this inefficiency is going to be a better path to better outcomes as an investor, and I firmly believe that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you there. So I think you spoke a lot to the assurance, and the reason I also wished to have your opinions on insurance is because we also touched on the importance of alternative investors as sort of resources for infrastructure investments. So in Africa, some of the largest infrastructure projects that are being done, they have this really unusual stack where the World Bank platform is really leveraged, across the board. They'll have MEGA with the risk underwriting, and then the IFC will come in to do a bit of equity, and then other sort of partners, international partners, will then be plugged in after the de-risking happens. Is there any level, of insurance that you think is important for a country that's looking to attract, private capital or alternative asset managers?
Well, it's a tough question because investing is really a craft of managing risks, full stop. And you really have got to think about risk as an asset, not a liability. And if you want to make a decent return, you've got a certain risk budget, and you have to be willing to accept risk as a consequence of that. So I think de-risking maybe some uncertainties in emerging market at the sovereign level is a tremendous way to sort of prime that pump. But to think about coming in where there's no risk, that also is a model for no reward as well, or allowing some kind of a proverbial put option to get out at cost does not seem to be a fair trade either. It's simply not how capital markets work, and it should never be the expectation of a sophisticated investor. So shining a brighter spotlight on opportunities in some of these countries is a tremendously positive thing to do, and finding some way, maybe at the sovereign, to provide some level of comfort for investors coming in. But beyond that, I think it's got to be between asset allocator and an investor of the capital, and the rest, hopefully, with the right due diligence, will yield the requisite returns.
Yeah, I can agree with that. So what are the elements of smart cities? What elements of smart cities are alternative investors presently interested in?
Well, yeah, I think it comes back to infrastructure as an example, and we haven't yet talked about at least directly the concept of ESG and the smart cities and smart states and smart countries have really got to be thinking about the longer term impacts of infrastructure, and particularly, and maybe even in real estate, in terms of how you construct a building, as an example. And is that building going to be future proof for the next 15, 20 years, because it's going to be standing at least that long? And being in the real estate development business right now is a tricky proposition, because if you don't get things right today and you're not forward looking, you could be standing in front of a stranded asset 5 to 7 years from now. So thinking about renewable energy as an example, and how solar power comes into play, and can that be had not only by panels on the roof of the building, but bricks that line the perimeter of that building as well. So there's a lot of rapidly developing technologies. It used to be cost prohibitive. The prices come way down, and then the price in fossil fuels, as we saw through COVID, particularly in the oil space, has just gotten crushed as well. So the trade of moving toward renewables is not as daunting as it once was. So I think that type of infrastructure and real estate investment and efficiencies are how we're going to see it. And the playbook of post-COVID still has not been written, Tieho. And we're talking about this at CAIA as an example, and I think every employer is thinking about it as well, where when COVID hit, certainly the US, and I think this was around the world, February, March timeframe, certainly here in North America, there were really just two options. It was go to your home office and go as quickly as possible. There was no rolling this out and I'm going to do it 30, 60, 90 days from now. It was a mandate, in many cases at the sovereign level, that these businesses are shut down and go home. It's not going to be as knee-jerk and sudden coming out the other side. And how we go back, when we go back, how we embrace some of these technology tools that were nascent coming into COVID. That we use Zoom for some of our board calls, but I treated it like a desktop telephone. The video camera never went on. And I never thought about using that as a substitute to jumping on a plane, flying 10,000 miles away, spending a couple nights in a hotel and flying back home again. So it's brought a lot of efficiencies to how commerce and worlds are going to work. And when, again, back to your question, when I think about smart cities and towns, what does it mean around office space? And if you look at a major city like New York or Boston, these large buildings that occupied banks and insurance companies and tech companies, is that what the employee wants? Is that what the employer wants? And are we going to be much more home-based and much more mobile in terms of our interaction with any type of entity? So a lot to be written there, and being responsible for the planning of a city and town, whoever that person is, he or she is grossly underpaid because it's a tremendous responsibility that they've taken on.
Wow. So there was one thing that you mentioned when you started to address this question, and it was ESG. There's a lot of misunderstanding, I know for a fact, amongst emerging economies, mainly because, when it comes to the environment and social aspects of investing or impact, they normally think of SDGs. Is there a really quick sort of difference or major difference that you would like to highlight for people, the difference between ESG and SDGs?
Well, I think there's a lot of acronyms in this space, and also there's a lot of for-profit and non-for-profit groups out there trying to shine a bright light on this. And two that I'll specifically mention is PRI, which is part of the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, and they've got their credos that they want asset managers and asset owners to sign on to. And I think they've been pretty successful in raising the specter about what the responsibilities are. The other one here locally in the U.S. is the Business Roundtable that just about a little over a year ago, I think it was August of 19, they came out with a pledge that is all about the stakeholder and much less about the shareholder. But the capital markets have shown us something very, very different, certainly through COVID. And this concept of putting the stakeholder first, or the concept of saying that these goals make sense, or I believe in ESG, those are just statements. And they're really not even worth the words on a piece of paper or the words coming out of the human's mouth. It really comes down to the actions associated with this. And there's again, here in the US, there was a back page article in today's Wall Street Journal on this very topic. And maybe some of these things I'm saying are themes I believed in, and I'm parroting some of the thoughts from that specific article. But it is about engagement. And I mentioned this earlier, I think, Tieho, in one of your other questions, that we as individuals have got to feel a level of responsibility, and we've got to feel a level of inconvenience. And again, the U.S. is likely to come back to the Paris Accord with this Biden administration coming in. We had pushed away from that under the prior administration. And again, that's signifying belief, but what are we doing about it? And again, we can't turn to the sovereign and say it's your responsibility. I think each one of us has to ask ourselves, as I wake up this morning, I should feel very inconvenienced about an insurmountable problem that if I don't address it, and I don't address it sooner rather than later, COVID is going to look like child's play when we have difficulty gasping our next breath. That could very much happen in the lifetime, maybe not of me, perhaps not of you, but certainly of our kids. And if I think about the responsibility that we have there, to not put that front and center is abhorrent in so many ways.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, this next one is perhaps my favorite, because even when I look at CAIA, the one designation that really turns me on is the new one that really focuses on data. So the question now is, what critical or premium data sets will smart cities produce for alternative investors? And just as a primer, I'd just like to mention, when you talked about real estate and asking that people get it right from the onset, is the issue of responsive buildings. So having different sensors around the building to alert people of potential fires, or even potential wear and tear when you look at the depreciation of the asset, just so you can have maintenance at real time. So would you just hit on that, please?
I think, are you still there, Tieho? I might have lost you.
I'm still here. Did you get the question?
Oh, guys, it broke out at the end. So I think I got the gist of the question. It broke up just ever so slightly. So it's interesting on this last point you made about sensors on buildings and making these buildings smarter. And on the one hand, alerting you to the potential fire in the building or a potential crime that's being committed. Or again, as we saw in Washington, D.C. last week, that the amount of video that was available to really take some of these folks that were responsible for creating just a heinous event could be found and at least tried and brought to the appropriate level of justice. But there is a fine line there, and maybe slightly off topic, but it occurred to me when I was hearing your question just now, is the concept of privacy and what our expectations are around that. So it's one thing that if I'm walking into a building and I get an alert from a sensor that there's been a gas leak or some other hazard and you should evacuate immediately, and the sensor picked this up well before any alarm or human nose could have, that's an awesome thing. But if I'm walking into the building with my cup of Starbucks and my facial recognition and my habits are being broadcasted back to some kind of a marketing agency or back to Starbucks headquarters, and they're pinging me with ads and the like, have I signed up for that? And maybe it's just a specific thing which I can maybe take to the broader question, which is, we have the concept of privacy being redefined right in front of our own eyes, and I don't think we really realize it. And I think about all of this data that's out there in the public domain. And one of my kids got me an Apple Watch for Christmas. And since then, I've become obsessed with closing these rings. I get up at 4:30 this morning. I forgot to put the watch on. I went running upstairs before 5 a.m. so I could get that first stand goal in there. But what I probably should be paying more attention to is, what the hell is Apple doing with all this data and who are they sharing it with? And when I downloaded this app, I'm sure that if I read the fine print, I signed my life away. So buyer beware, yes, but is Apple's expectation that only 20% of the people are going to sign up for this? Surely not. So I think that we've got an information asymmetry here around what the consumer thinks this data is being used for and helping them versus what the corporate conglomerate is doing with it on the other side. And back to our program, this Financial Data Professional Institute, a big part of this, Tieho, is data ethics. And as this definition of privacy is being redefined and what it means around ethical behavior, we're trying to encourage the professional to say, hey, right now, this is on us. We have a responsibility to get this right. And certainly we're capitalists in that part of the equation. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we should also recognize the responsibilities that go along with that. And the challenge we have, and maybe the opportunity is, it is wide open. It's up to us to define it, good, bad, or indifferent. But someday, the regulator and the consumer is going to catch up. And they're going to find out what was done and what was not done with perfect 20/20 hindsight. And if we have a codification of regulation around enforcement actions and other bad deeds committed by the first mover in the space, you can imagine the black eye and then some it's going to give to any industry, particularly asset management. So I think we're sitting on the cusp of a tremendous amount of data, a tremendous amount of inefficiency, a tremendous amount of potential alpha that goes along with that. But like anything else, we've got to use it with tremendous care, tremendous responsibility, and through a lens that might have a 2025 date attached to it.
Yep. So that actually will lead into one of the interviews that I'm actually working on right now, where we'll be talking about the smart city as a computer, because it really is. The same user policies that you have on a smartphone when you use certain apps that deal with location, facial recognition, and all of that. These buildings have just become oversized versions of our smartphones. And each and every different room or part of the vicinity will be kind of like an application where you are either a user or an authorizer of the application. So just to simplify this for lawmakers and regulators, I think just look at it as smartphones. These buildings in these cities are really just huge smartphones. Next question is, how do alternative investments add to sustainable economics?
Well, I mentioned before this concept of a double bottom line. And I think that's more evasive than real to a large degree, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think a big part of it gets into something I think you mentioned a moment ago, Tieho, about the long-term nature of investing. And if my goal is to be churning my portfolio every single day or every single month, and I've got in and out of the equity markets, which we're seeing a lot of late, and leveraged trades on the likes of Tesla and market indices. That is not necessarily the way an investor should think and operate. It's how a market participant thinks and operates. So if I think about the long-term nature of investing and the responsibilities and return expectations that come with that, then I think the double bottom line comes into much more of a crystallized view. And maybe not to harp too much on your real estate and smart building analogy, but we've mentioned it before, that when you think about the long-term nature of some of these assets, it is part of your due diligence to be thinking about some of these aspects around a double bottom line, around ESG, because ESG is not a fashion statement. It is a risk. And like any other risk that an investor is taking on, you've got to be thinking about how that factors into your long-term calculus. And if you put investing through this long-term view, I think it's a lot clearer to understand ESG risks and bring this back home, certainly in the US. And I think parts of the world are very, very different on this. But if I'm a public company and we have earnings season coming out right now and an S&P that's trading probably 23 times forward-looking earnings when historical averages were 17 and 18, the market is priced for perfection. But if I was a public company, I said, hey, you know what, Mr. or Mrs. Analyst, I missed my forward-looking earnings guidance by 5 cents on a share, but I put all these solar panels on the roof of my building. How many investors do you think are going to stand up and cheer for that? I'll ruin the punchline for you and offer that it would be zero. So I think that investors, we are very impatient. We want to be rewarded today for both today's accomplishments, prior accomplishments, and we have mortgaged that into the future. And I think that that is a very dangerous game that we're playing, not only as investors, but for society as a whole.
All right, okay. And in your opinion, so this is going to be the last question from me, and after I ask this one, you may feel free to add any additional points that you think are important for the listeners. But in closing, I would just like to ask, in your opinion, what elements of smart cities will contribute to a better city life?
Well, I've got 5 kids of my own, and they're at various ages. I've got one who's just 16, but my 4 older ones are grown adults out of the house, and they range in age from 24 up to 30, and they're out living in various parts of the world. One is in Massachusetts, but one is in New York, one is in Atlanta, one is in Providence, Rhode Island. And it's interesting to look at the world through their lens and how they identify as citizens, not only of a city and a town, but also of a world, and what they want and what their expectations are. And I think this concept of more of an urban type of a setting seems to be what this group wants. And I remember when I turned 16, which was the age to get your driver's license in the US, that I was first online. And as soon as I turned whatever the age was, 16 and a half, or the requisite time of training, I got my driver's license immediately. But the concepts around driving and accessibility of what I want through an automobile is really arcane thinking. And what these kids want, and these these groups, maybe from early 20s to mid 30s, the most recent generation and tomorrow's consumer, their habits and desires and wants and needs are very, very different, I think, than they were when I was that age. And their dependency on getting a complete, both personal and professional experience within the city or town that they live, and having a much more tech enabled. And these are tech natives, Tieho, as you know. I think that is going to change the landscape, and I think the cities that respond well are going to do an awesome job at it. And Atlanta is one. I'll use it as an example where my daughter Abby lives. I traveled to Atlanta many, many years ago when I first get out from college, and it's not a city I loved all that much. That city has got its act together, and it's awesome how they build these little pods of communities. They've created this concept of a belt line that goes around the city, not around the city, but it sort of wanders. And I don't know if it was an old railway bed or not, but they've built many, many communities around this, and it's really connected a lot of neighborhoods into a very urban and kind of a cool space. And while I'm not so young anymore, I feel a lot younger when I go down there, and I feel invigorated, and it's lively and vibrant. And I think that's what tomorrow's city and town should be thinking about. And if your listeners want a model, I would say fly to Atlanta, and you'll have it there.
Fantastic. Well, Bill, if that will be all from your side, I'd just like to say a big thank you again. And I hope that, people take this to heart, and let's just keep doing what we do to help building better communities. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. No, I do appreciate it, Tieho. And you said I could ask you some questions. Is that still allowed, or are you going to cut me off?
Well, you can ask me questions. Please feel free.
Okay, so I have one closing one, and this was not rehearsed, which is all the better. But it's Tuesday, January 19th in the United States. I'm not sure when this podcast goes live, but we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day yesterday, and that was at the culmination of a very difficult year around the world to some degree, but maybe primarily in the U.S. and maybe some European cities and certainly the UK. And a big part of this discussion was what it means to be Black. And I think it caused reflection, self-reflection in many parts of the world. And you're sitting in a very interesting spot because you toggle between the United States and Africa, and maybe in Africa, where and what it means to be Black might be very different about what it means in the U.S. But our industry, and we talked ESG broadly, but more specifically, has done an abysmal job around D&I. And I'm just curious about your vantage point as a young Black man to what our industry should be doing, because your advice actually is going to help me. It's something I very much believe is a miss, and that's putting it as maybe overly kind, but more of responsibility and an opportunity for doing it better going forward. So maybe a good way to close out, because it's going to help me to get some of your views on such an important topic.
Of course, and it's an absolute honor just to be included in the same sentence as Dr. King. But to answer your question, I think this is an issue of an evolution of mankind. It's not so much to do with this race or that geography or the other. I think that what we noticed is that we've always had these. At the beginning, when the world wasn't so densely populated by human beings, there was a huge incentive to have a huge fence around your city or your town or village, whatever the ancient people used to call it. You would benefit from having those small pods, those small cells of a community. And then over time, people got very industrious, and then that's when all these empires started coming up and all these dynasties that wanted to span the globe, right? And so that's how we have our sovereign nations of today. But it seems like we're at a point where there's actually very little incentive for us to perpetuate these fences, whether the fence is a flag or the border or the trade agreements or that type of thing. I think that we just need to find a future and a dialogue that speaks to the nature of the fast-paced life that is happening right now. I think social media is a very good example of that, because for me, even personally, I wasn't really connected to a lot of people around the world, you would get on a plane and go to a place, but you never felt really connected. And I could say 10, 15 years ago, when I started getting heavy into CNBC and Bloomberg, I would see stuff happening in Asia, in the Middle East, and it really didn't touch my heart that much. And I'm sorry to say this. But with, the fast-paced nature of social media, on my feeds, I can see what's happening in the Middle East. Between breakfast and lunch, I could get 5 different feeds about the Middle East. And these are, really engaging conversations. And when stuff like that, starts to happen, I could feel connected more to the Middle East, more than I would be, connected to my immediate vicinity. And that's simply because, it's all about like-minded people. And now it really doesn't matter where your tribe is. But as long as people who share the same values as you, are being, are being hurt, or their views are not being considered, that kind of hurts you as well. So, I think the biggest thing right now should be how can we redefine the issue of sovereignty and its role, because I think that the digital economy and digital global society have kind of transcended the physical idea of sovereignty. I'm not particularly qualified to speak about that, but there's something happening. And we're at an inflection point where, I think these physical borders are being transcended, and we need to find, a meaning of what they really mean and to what extent we should prioritize on them. But on the issue of race, I just feel like, it could have been any race. Black people could have been, I don't know, purple people, or they could have been turquoise people. For me, I think the race thing, it hurts obviously because I'm Black, and I, could have friends that I see being marginalized and that type of thing. But it's just a position that, by chance I find myself in, just because of, the pigment or the melanin or whatever. But honestly speaking, I think the race thing for me, again, I think it's just big business. It's just big business that got out of hand. If you think about how slavery came about, most slavery in Africa was only possible because Africans were already enslaving Africans. So people just, went all out and said, okay, so, we can do whatever we want to their people because the leaders there are already doing it. So it's really not a race thing for me. It's just about how can we just harmonize and unify um, and have an idea meritocracy, as Ray Dalio would say, right? Let's just let the best ideas win, and share the human spirit, as opposed to prioritizing on all of the physical differences. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I know I've been, around a lot of points, but I hope that answers the question.
Well, yeah, I appreciate your honesty there, Tieho, and it's a very complex undertaking problem, and in need of a proactive solution that really involves a lot of people across the spectrum. And if I ever have the courage to start my own podcast, maybe I'll have you on as an early guest to explore this more, because this could fill at least 45 minutes and then some. But your perspective, your optimism, pragmatic views of this give me something to think about. So I do appreciate that, and it's something that is near and dear to our mission. So thank you for the opportunity today, and most importantly, for your answer just now.
It's always a pleasure to share with you, Bill. And of course, the honor is all mine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Stay safe. Hope to see you sometime in 2021. Thanks, Tieho.
Me too. Me too. My regards to you and the family, Bill. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.